Some men don't need enemies to ruin them. They manage to do it to themselves, one careless sentence after another. Not through fists, but through phrases that might sound bold, self-assured, maybe even wise. But beneath the surface, they're just fear dressed in laziness. You've heard them before. Those lines that suggest a man has quit growing, stopped thinking, and chosen instead to coast. The Stoics warned, speech is the mirror of the mind. And when your words are built around excuses and ego, your life quietly follows suit. This video isn't about being gentle. We're pulling back the curtain on 6 things foolish men say. These are the kinds of phrases that quietly chip away at your self-discipline, your dignity, and your respect. And you won't even notice until the damage is already done. More importantly, we'll reveal what a Stoic man says in their place. Because language isn't just background noise. It's a signal. It either sharpens your soul or it sells it off, bit by bit. If you've ever said something and instantly felt the sting of weakness behind it, this one's gonna cut deep, in the best way. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment. I'd rather be quiet than sound like a fool. Now let's break the silence, before your words do more harm than any enemy ever could. Number 1, that's just how I am. One of the most subtly destructive things a man can utter is, that's just who I am. It sounds resolute, sounds final, but beneath the surface, it's pure surrender. Not surrender to truth or principle, but to stagnation. This phrase is usually spoken by men who've confused being immovable with being strong. They don't evolve, don't question themselves. They simply dig in, year after year, mistaking stillness for strength. But that's not integrity, it's ego wearing a lazy disguise. I once knew a man named Carl, a retired Navy guy, sharply dressed, 70 years old, and able to command a room with barely a word. But those who knew him well understood the truth. He was stuck, emotionally frozen. Anytime his wife asked for more vulnerability, Carl would mutter, "I'm not built like that." When his son tried opening up about old wounds, Carl shut it down. "That's not how I do things." His relationships didn't explode, they slowly crumbled into dust. Nothing changed. Nothing moved. Eventually, nothing remained. When his wife left, she didn't slam the door, she simply stopped waiting for a man who refused to grow. That's what makes this phrase so dangerous. It sounds like conviction, but it's really a prison sentence disguised as strength. Stoic philosophy refuses to tolerate that kind of self-abandonment. Seneca wrote, "As long as you live, keep learning how to live." And that wisdom cuts deeper the older you get. Life never stops shaping you, unless you stop listening. Too many men, especially as they age, confuse experience with insight. But the two don't always walk hand in hand. A man who keeps repeating the same excuse becomes a statue of himself, solid, unmoving, and eventually forgotten. A Stoic man doesn't hide behind identity, he refines it. He listens, not because he's weak, but because he's wise enough to know that every day brings a new chance to sharpen who he is. Discipline doesn't mean staying the same, it means choosing growth over pride. The man who says, "That's just how I am," hasn't only stopped evolving, he's begun to decay. And once that rot takes root, it spreads into everything. His words get shorter, his mind closes, his life shrinks into routine and resistance, until all that's left is a tired phrase and a list of people who gave up waiting for him to change. The Stoic doesn't grip his identity like armor. He wields truth like a whetstone. He adjusts, he evolves. Not because the world demands it, but because his own soul does. And if that first phrase didn't sting, just wait. The next one cuts even deeper. Number 2, real men don't talk about feelings. According to research from the American Psychological Association, men who bottle up their emotions face a much higher risk of depression, heart disease, and even early death. Yet this damaging belief keeps getting passed down, especially among older generations, that real men don't talk about feelings. It's handed down like an heirloom and worn like a badge. But at its core, it's just fear in disguise. Men who cling to this mindset aren't proving their strength. They're dodging an inner war they're too afraid to face. This phrase isn't about masculinity. It's about hiding. It's the emotional version of drawing the blinds and hoping the storm will pass. But all it does is let pain and resentment fester beneath the surface, until it erupts as anger, addiction, or complete emotional detachment. The man who believes he has to bury everything to earn respect is actually burying himself alive. Stoicism is often misunderstood here. People hear control your emotions and think it means deny them. But that's not Stoicism. That's avoidance. The Stoics didn't teach emotional suppression, they taught emotional clarity. Marcus Aurelius, one of history's most powerful rulers, wrote openly in his journals about his fears, grief, and flaws. He didn't broadcast them. He examined them so they wouldn't control him. The Stoic man doesn't fear emotion. He fears being ruled by emotions he's never faced. Emotional maturity doesn't mean collapsing in public. It also doesn't mean numbing yourself into some Stoic imitation. It means observing your inner world, quietly, honestly, and choosing to respond with stillness, not impulse. The men who refuse to speak about what they carry are often carrying the most. They think that showing no cracks protects them. But the cracks are what let wisdom shine through. To speak, deliberately, without apology, about what burdens you is a form of strength most never achieve. The man who never shares his inner world is often the one most controlled by it. And if he can't admit the truth to himself, someone else will eventually live in the shadow of that silence. Stoicism doesn't demand your silence, it demands your honesty. You don't need to cry in public, but you do need to stop pretending that you don't feel. Because the next phrase, that's where blame begins its slow, corrosive work. Let's talk about the man who dodges ownership with a phrase that feels harmless, but does lasting damage. Number 3, it's not my fault. Few phrases reveal a man's internal weakness more quickly than the words, it's not my fault. On the surface, it can sound like a defense, but underneath, it's really a confession, a quiet surrender of personal power. This is the voice of a man who's given up control over his life. He sees himself as the victim of circumstance, never the cause, never the solution. And that mindset doesn't just chip away at his dignity, it strips meaning from his entire existence. The Stoics saw this pattern of thinking as the beginning of moral collapse. Epictetus wrote, "It is not events that disturb us, but our opinions about them." In other words, your situation isn't usually the real enemy. It's your interpretation of that situation that gives it weight. And no interpretation is more corrosive than the belief that the responsibility always lies with someone else. The man who constantly blames the economy, his boss, his upbringing, his ex, or even fate itself isn't expressing his pain. He's handing over his power. And worse, in doing so, he silences the one voice that could change everything, his own. Marcus Aurelius reminded us, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. The man who refuses to realize that truth isn't being stoic, he's being shackled by excuses. Blame is easy. It's the default for men who haven't yet learned to reflect. But responsibility? That takes structure. It means giving up the comfort of waiting for apologies or for conditions to improve, and instead asking the one uncomfortable question, what can I control? And the answer is always the same, your reaction, your direction, your discipline. Older men, especially those who've endured years of hardship, often carry deep emotional and financial scars. And yes, many of those wounds weren't self-inflicted, but dragging that pain forward and using it as permission to stagnate, that's not strength. That's cowardice dressed in nostalgia. The Stoic doesn't deny the pain, he just refuses to let it rule him. Seneca put it plainly, a gem cannot be polished without friction, nor a man perfected without trials. Life will wear you down, but blaming the friction, that doesn't make you stronger. Enduring it with grace and growing from it does. So next time something falls apart and those familiar words rise up, it's not my fault, pause, catch them, replace them. Don't say, it's not my fault, say, it's now my responsibility. Because that shift, that small act of ownership, is the line that separates the man who stays bitter from the one who chooses to get better. Number 4, I deserve better. Few statements carry the quiet arrogance of I deserve better. On the surface, it may sound like a declaration of self-respect, but often it's just a thin veil for resentment and inactivity. Men who speak this way tend not to be the ones putting in the silent daily work of actually becoming better. Instead, they wait, they demand, they expect the world, or the people in it, to just deliver something greater to them. Cleaner, easier, more rewarding. But Stoicism dismantles this entitlement from its foundation. It teaches that life owes you nothing. Dignity doesn't come from what you think you're entitled to. It comes from what you cultivate, regardless of the outcome. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, "Do not waste time wondering what a good man should be one." That line cuts right through entitlement. It doesn't ask what you've been denied, it asks what you're doing right now to live with virtue. The man who constantly says, "I deserve better," is usually doing far less than he thinks and expecting far more than he's earned. He's traded the humility of real effort for the hunger of complaint. The Stoic doesn't walk through life with a list of what he's owed. He moves through it with discipline, with silence, with the willingness to do what's hard without asking for applause. Epictetus put it sharply, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." That's the opposite of entitlement. That's embodiment. Entitled men often confuse dissatisfaction with growth, but they're not the same. Dissatisfaction without discipline breeds only bitterness. True growth requires discomfort, responsibility, and restraint. The Stoic never says, "I want what's mine." He says, "I will become what I admire, regardless of the reward." For many older men, this phrase creeps in during quiet crises, when relationships are faltering, when careers plateau, when long-sought recognition never arrives. The temptation is to blame others for not seeing your worth. But here's the reality: if you spend more time declaring your value than developing it, you've already lost the thread. Seneca wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." And one of the worst ways we waste it is demanding rewards for work never done. A man of substance, a man of Stoic character, doesn't say, "I deserve better." He asks, "Am I still sharpening?" Because that question forces him to stay accountable to the process, not just the prize. And when a man falls too deeply into entitlement, what comes next is even worse. He stops showing up, he stops leading, he stops engaging. Let's move now to the phrase that reveals a man who's abandoned responsibility under the disguise of boundaries. Number 5, that's not my job. You'll hear this one from men who have quietly stopped leading, but still want to be seen as dependable. The phrase, "That's not my job," sounds like a firm boundary. But more often, it's just avoidance dressed up as maturity. Men who live by it slowly shrink their presence until all that remains is duty and routine. They confuse minimal effort with balance, and gradually they trade impact for comfort, until their worth is tied only to what's been assigned to them, not what needs to be done. I once knew a man named Rye, an old machinist from Pittsburgh. Worked the factory line for 3 decades, never missed a day. Showed up like clockwork at 5 a.m., but at home he lived by "not my job." Dishes, not his job. Helping his teenage son make decisions, not his job. Emotional conversations with his wife, definitely not his job. He provided, he paid bills, he showed up for the bare minimum, and called it being dependable. When his wife finally left after 28 years, he sat in the same kitchen chair and said, "I did everything I was supposed to." And maybe he did. But he never asked what actually needed to be done, only what was written on the checklist. And that's not leadership, that's silent withdrawal. The Stoics never defined strength as just doing your duty. They aimed higher. They lived by purpose. Marcus Aurelius asked, "What is your vocation?" To be a good man. Not a man hiding behind a job description, but a man who sees a gap and fills it. Stoic strength means showing up, even when it's thankless, even when it's invisible, even when no one's counting. The man who only does what's on the list is secretly hoping someone else will take care of what he avoids. When a man repeats, "That's not my job," what he's really saying is, "I don't want the burden of responsibility." He's not drawing a line, he's surrendering his influence. A Stoic understands that power isn't found in what you avoid, it's in what you embrace, especially when no one's watching. Because once you start outsourcing your effort, your value soon follows. You stop being someone others rely on and become someone they work around. Now let's look at one final phrase, the most insidious one of all. The one that doesn't just dull your action, but numbs your soul. Number 6, it is what it is. According to behavioral science, one of the earliest warning signs of learned helplessness in adults is verbal resignation. The moment someone begins to believe their actions no longer affect their outcomes. And no phrase signals that surrender more clearly than the quiet shrug of, "It is what it is." At first, it can sound stoic, detached, maybe even enlightened, but beneath the surface, it's anything but. For many men, especially those worn down by years of disappointment, this phrase becomes less of a mindset and more of a slow death sentence. It isn't acceptance, it's apathy disguised as wisdom. The Stoics did teach us to accept what we cannot control, but they never encouraged us to give up agency over what we still can influence. Marcus Aurelius said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That's not a call to surrender. It's a call to act, wisely and deliberately. When a man leans on, "It is what it is," too often, he's no longer practicing stoic endurance. He's falling into emotional numbness. Seneca took the idea even further. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. And the man who uses this phrase repeatedly isn't just wasting time, he's draining his conviction. He's dulling his ambition. He's masking disinterest as maturity. What makes this phrase truly dangerous is how silently it spreads. It seeps into relationships, into purpose, into health. A man who stops acting with intention becomes someone who watches his life unfold from a distance, like a stranger. Detached, passive, increasingly irrelevant. There's a crucial difference between composure and capitulation. Stoic composure says, "I see things as they are, and I will respond with clarity." Capitulation says, "I see it, and I'm done trying." One sharpens you, the other sedates you. A Stoic doesn't whisper, "It is what it is," when life gets difficult. He pauses, he observes, and then he responds. Not with rage, not with complaint, but with precision, with presence. Life will hurt, people will fail you. The world won't always move in your favor. But that's not an excuse to rot into passivity. So next time that phrase rises in your chest, stop. Ask yourself, is this true acceptance, or am I just too tired to care? Because every time you choose apathy over action, you become easier to ignore. And one day, if you're not careful, you'll wake up not respected, not feared, not loved, but simply unnoticed. And that's the cruelest fate for a man who once had the strength to lead, but forgot how to use it. Let's end this with clarity. Because once you recognize that these 6 phrases are quietly corroding your strength, the only question that remains is, what will you choose to say instead? Every man leaves a trail. Sometimes it's in his footsteps. Sometimes it's in the words he mutters when no one's watching. The truth is, most people won't judge you by your intentions or even your past. They'll judge you by what slips out when you're not performing. And these 6 phrases? They don't just sound weak, they are weakness, distilled into language, repeated until they become personality. But here's the good news. That personality isn't permanent. Not if you have the guts to confront it. Weakness itself isn't the enemy. Denial is. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." So if you speak like a victim, expect to live like one. But if you start speaking with clarity, even when you're alone, even in private, you begin to rebuild something far more powerful than reputation. You rebuild character. A Stoic man doesn't talk just to be heard. He speaks with precision, with restraint, with awareness. And when he's silent, that silence carries weight. If this video struck a nerve, let it. That discomfort, that's where the growth begins. Now leave a comment. I choose strength over sound, because while foolish men fill the air with noise, the wise speak and the world leans in. What are your views on this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I will personally read all of your comments. And if you seriously want to level up in life, don't forget to show some love by hitting the like and subscribe button. Stay strong. Until next time.